Asserting central influence immediately, this pawn launch aims to dominate space and open diagonals for immediate piece development. Unleashing knightly pressure, Black immediately contests the center's influence and prepares for rapid development. Asserting central dominion, c4 immediately fights for space and prepares to challenge nf6 influence. Preparing Fianchetto to pressure the center and contest the queen side. Establishing a Fianchetto structure with this pawn advance prepares for rapid piece development and potential central pressure. Establishing the Fianchettoed bishop on its ideal long diagonal offers excellent attacking potential against White's kingside and secures a strong defensive post. Developing the bishop to g2 solidifies the Fianchetto, preparing for castling and controlling the long diagonal. Securing the monarch amid the pawns establishes a safe harbor, preparing for central expansion. Developing the knight here solidifies the center and prepares for potential pawn advances, aiming to cramp Black's kingside space. Solidifying central pawn presence and preparing to contest the d-file opens up a solid positional setup for Black. Securing central influence and preparing for queenside expansion, knight to f3 solidifies White's structure and allows for potential kingside development, subtly nudging towards a more flexible and less rigid pawn formation that anticipates Black's Fianchetto. Confronting the central pawn chain directly, Black aggressively challenges White's space with a dynamic pawn break. Securing the king allows for future piece maneuvering, setting the stage for a potential pawn break or piece development without immediate defensive concerns. Emerging from the Kings-Indian setup, nc6 immediately challenges White's central pawn structure, aiming to disrupt their comfortable space and potentially open lines for future counterplay. Initiating a bold pawn thrust, White seeks to seize territory and cramp Black's queenside, forcing a strategic reevaluation of piece placement and potential pawn breaks for both sides. Exploring the queenside flank, the knight aims to challenge White's central pawn mass from an unexpected angle, potentially preparing to pry open the b-file or gain influence on c4. The knight repositions to a more flexible square, anticipating a potential pawn advance or supporting a regrouping of pieces on the queenside. Opening the center with e6 aims to challenge White's pawn chain and potentially create queenside play, but it risks weakening Black's king's defense if not carefully managed. Positioning the queen here actively contests central squares and prepares for a potential queenside pawn push. Embracing the center clash, Black opens the e-file for potential piece activity, accepting a pawn structure that will demand careful maneuvering to exploit the newly created diagonal for the dark-squared bishop. Clearing the central files unlocks the bishops and offers better piece activity for White after the d-pawn's advance and subsequent capture, promising a more dynamic middle game. Positioning the rook on b8 is a proactive attempt to contest the open c-file that will soon emerge, while simultaneously preparing to support a potential queenside pawn push like b5. Bolstering the queenside pawn chain, this maneuver aims to solidify White's central control and create a more robust pawn structure, preventing immediate Black pawn breakthroughs while preparing for potential queenside expansion later. Black's ambitious pawn thrust on b5 aims to unlock the queenside and challenge White's central grip, potentially opening lines for the rook and bishop. Bringing the bishop to b2 activates it on the long diagonal, aiming to exert pressure along the b1h7 diagonal and potentially support an advance on the kingside or simply maintain central influence. Black seeks to activate the rook along the e-file, aiming to contest this central open lane and potentially support a pawn break with e5 or c4 later on, while also improving piece coordination in preparation for further maneuvering. Injecting central pressure and preparing for pawn breaks, the rook finally finds its open file, hinting at future skirmishes on the e-file. Introducing a bishop to this central diagonal offers an aggressive look towards White's queenside, while simultaneously clearing the path for the rook to potentially participate on the e-file. Puncturing the center with this pawn thrust initiates a dynamic struggle for central control and opens diagonals for White's pieces, particularly the queen and king's bishop, aiming to exploit the weakened central squares now that black's pawn chain has been fractured. Preparing to challenge white's central pawn chain is the immediate objective, and the bishop repositions itself to contribute to that effort. White aggressively challenges the queenside pawn structure, aiming to disrupt black's intending queenside expansion and potentially open lines for attack. Challenging the central pawn structure and asserting flank initiative, this maneuver on the queenside creates immediate tension, forcing white to reconsider their advanced central pawns and open lines for the rooks. Asserting dominion over the central dark squares with the knight pivot to b5, white boldly challenges black's pawn structure and aims to disrupt the harmony of its pieces. This maneuver isn't just about occupying a strong outpost. It's a subtle declaration that white is ready to initiate a more dynamic phase of the game, potentially exploiting the slight disarray created by black's recent pawn thrusts and the open c-file. Observe how this knight might soon collaborate with the bishop on g2, creating menacing pressure along the a4-e8 diagonal. Black resolves the immediate queenside pawn tension by removing white's active knight and opens a diagonal for the queen, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated setup, although it grants white a slight spatial advantage on the queenside for the moment. Unlocking the file with tempo, this capture boldly injects activity into white's queenside and forces black's pieces to react, potentially disrupting their carefully constructed pawn structure and opening avenues for a later queenside expansion. The rook's repositioning to the 5th rank injects immediate dynamism into the queenside, aiming to dismantle white's pawn structure and exploit the open b-file with significant pressure. Unveiling the bishop from its protective pawn shield, white initiates a strategic redeployment, aiming to anchor the piece on a more active diagonal and potentially support a kingside advance. This repositioning subtly shifts the center of gravity, eyeing the weakened dark squares on black's queenside now that the knight has retreated and the pawns are somewhat spread. It's a quiet maneuver, signaling a potential buildup of pressure rather than an immediate tactical onslaught, and it also prepares for potential piece exchanges, aiming to simplify into an advantageous endgame. The knight's repositioning opens a tantalizing diagonal for the queen and prepares to contest the crucial central squares, hinting at an immediate push to undermine white's pawn structure. A surprising maneuver, aiming to activate the rook on an open file while simultaneously cramping black's queenside space and restricting the bishop's scope. This aggressive positioning might overlook the potential for black's pieces to coordinate a counterstrike, particularly if white's king becomes exposed by the pawn advances. Shifting the knight to this square is a fascinating repositioning maneuver, aiming to create a more dynamic presence on the queenside and potentially support a future c5 thrust. It eyes the weakened squares around white's kingside and hints at a desire to reroute the knight to a more active outpost, perhaps on c5 or even e5 if circumstances allow. The knight's journey from a5 to b7 is a testament to black's patient maneuvering, seeking to find its optimal position away from the initial pressure and into a more constructive role. Repositioning the queen to b1 aims to consolidate white's queenside structure and prepare for potential pawn advances, while also eyeing the weak f7 square and offering a safer haven than its previous post, which was susceptible to black's growing influence along the c-file and the b-file. Unleashing a queenside pawn thrust, black immediately challenges white's central control and aims to disrupt the harmony of white's pieces, particularly the knight now stranded on b7. Opening the queen's diagonal to potentially support a kingside advance. A daring thrust to rupture white's central grip, exploiting the slightwardness of the queen's knight and the advanced pawns, though it weakens the queenside pawn structure considerably. Opening the long diagonal for the queen and bishop is a crucial step, directly addressing the isolated pawns and creating attacking potential. Unleashing the knight towards the queenside, 23, and c5 injects dynamic tension, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially fork pieces. Black strategically repositions a knight from a cramped defensive post into an active attacking role, eyeing weaknesses around white's king and the c3 square. This maneuver forces white to reassess their aggressive pawn thrust on the queenside and consider the implications of this centralizing knight. Seizing the open file, White dramatically forces a liquidation of the queenside material, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the king. Although this aggressive action might also simplify the position prematurely if black can re-establish their defenses effectively. Sacrificing the knight to ignite a wildfire of counterplay in the center and potentially open lines towards white's king embodies a bold strategic gamble, aiming to disrupt white's seemingly solid pawn structure and activate black's dormant pieces. Opening up lines for the rook on the 7th rank becomes a serious concern, as the bishop clears the diagonal, potentially creating discovered attacks or forcing material exchanges that could benefit white's queenside pawn majority. Black liberates the pinned knight, aiming to disrupt white's queenside control and contest the now open d-file. This maneuver fundamentally alters the tactical landscape, transforming the previous static positional struggle into a dynamic battle for initiative. Observe how this repositioning directly challenges the rook on a4 and potentially opens diagonals for black's pieces, creating new avenues for counterplay. A desperate attempt to disrupt black's attacking coordination. This bishop repositioning gambles on a swift counterattack that might overwhelm black's currently lax king safety, though it sacrifices valuable tempo. Exchanging the rook on the open e-file is a pragmatic decision, immediately simplifying the position and liberating the knight on b7 from any potential pressure on that rank, while also preparing to potentially contest control of the central files should white's king find a safer haven.